The Pacer by August W. Derleth and Mark R. Shorer. Mr. William Larkins adjusted his monocle with a very determined air. Then he brushed an imaginary thread from his lapel, raised his eyebrows slightly, and turned to the house agent, still talking volubly. "It is people in my business, Mr. Collins," said Mr. Larkins somewhat icily, "who start rumors of this sort. This is by far the most desirable of the houses you have yet shown me, and I am determined to take it for the winter at the price you quoted me." "You authors are a funny lot," answered the agent somewhat testily. "But we take no responsibility, especially in regards to anything out of the ordinary that may happen while you're in the building." Mr. Larkins regarded the agent for a moment. Then he removed his monocle, polished it, and returned it to his eye. The agent shuffled his feet nervously. "I should think that the modern businessman would have something else on his mind than stories of haunted houses," remarked Mr. Larkins dryly. Mr. Collins became suddenly apologetic. "It is not that we believe these things, Mr. Larkins," and he spread his hands and smiled deprecatingly. "But the amount of complaints we've received from other people who've rented this place can't be entirely disregarded. Then there's that closed room. A lot of people object to that, but one fellow opened it and, well, he died shortly after." Mr. Collins coughed. "It will not be necessary that I use the second floor at all," put Mr. Larkins. "So you need have no fear about that closed room. As long as it doesn't bother me, I will not bother the room." "Of course," said Mr. Collins, and "of course," again, and would perhaps have gone on, but Mr. Larkins interrupted him. "If I may ask, on what are these rumors based?" "Just noises, as if someone were walking around up there." The agent made a vague sort of gesture that included the entire second story. "I see," said Mr. Larkins thoughtfully. "Of course, all these stories go back to the time when John Brent lived here," the agent went on. "You refer to the scientist Brent, the man who died insane?" asked Mr. Larkins, absently tapping the wall with his stick. "Yes, that's the man. Perhaps you knew him, Mr. Larkins." "I'm afraid not, Mr. Collins. It is not a practice of mine to associate with people who are slightly unbalanced mentally. I can say that I remember him, however. The man and his ridiculous theories attracted quite a bit of public attention. He died here in this house." "Dear me," exclaimed Mr. Larkins, for the first time showing interest. "And it is his ghost that walks?" No, Mr. Larkins, it's quite a different story. None of us fully understands it, and it's supposed that this man Brent had a hand in what's haunting the house. Something to do with one of his theories?" "Yes, that's it. I'm not quite sure what it's all about, Mr. Larkins, but I can find out if you wish." "Oh, no, don't go to any trouble. The matter doesn't worry me in the least, Mr. Collins. It's merely a passing interest. Don't trouble yourself." "As far as I know," continued Mr. Collins, "it has something to do with some theory about drawing spirits out of the ether, or some such idea." "I think I've heard of it," interrupted Mr. Larkins. "I understand it was not quite a success." "I couldn't say, Mr. Larkins. I'm sure I couldn't say." "No," said Mr. Larkins rather sharply. "I didn't suppose you could. But as I said before, the matter is inconsequential. Of very little importance indeed. And I believe that we can dismiss it. Shall we, Mr. Collins?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Larkins. Yes, sir, of course." "Good," said Mr. Larkins, and was about to go in when the agent interrupted him. "And you're still certain you want this house?" "Quite," said Mr. Larkins in a cold voice edged with reproof. "And the sooner the better. In fact, I suggest that we attend to the matter at once without further delay." "Anything you say, Mr. Larkins." "Very good. We shall go at once." Mr. William Larkins's forte was the romantic novel, and he had just succeeded in arousing the literary critics of the continent to a sense of his importance. At the appearance of his first book, they hailed him as just another new writer, which so irritated Mr. Larkins that he produced his masterpiece, Isola, which caught and held the veneration of such capable men as Alonzo Compton of the Mirror, to say nothing of Carlo Jenkins of the Times. Mr. Larkins was engaged on his third novel, Island Gods, when he discovered the necessity of quiet and unassuming winter quarters, whereupon he departed at once for St. John's Wood, a section of London that he had before been pleased with. Not quite a week later, he descended with his belongings on number 21 and took quiet possession. Mr. William Larkins had quite forgotten all about the rumors concerning the haunting of number 21, when the matter was brought to his mind in a very irritating manner. It was 6 days after he had taken up occupation, and Mr. Larkins was engaged on his third novel. As a matter of fact, he had just succeeded in depositing his hero on a desert island, with no immediate thought of how to rescue him, when he became aware of a most annoying disturbance on the second floor. For a moment, Mr. Larkins forgot his surroundings. He began to curse the tenants above under his breath in no very genteel manner. But suddenly he bethought himself of the emptiness of the floor above. It took him some moments more to think of the rumors he had heard from the agent. Mr. Larkins was distinctly not a believer in any form of the supernatural. For some time he sat very still, listening. The sound seemed to be that of a man pacing to and fro in a narrow space. Mr. Larkins had a mental picture of the closed room. The pacing was not, however, very regular. It was punctuated at odd intervals by a furious pounding sound, as if the tenant were hammering on the door or the walls, reflected the author. Usually such an interval was followed by a curious padding sound, as if the tenant were running in a circle around the room. Eventually this resolved into the steady pacing, which became to Mr. Larkins more and more monotonous as he sat there listening. Another of Mr. Larkins's attributes was an unshakable bravery, torn between the impossibility of writing with such an annoying disturbance above his head, and investigating, leaving his hero to languish for some unpremeditated hours on the island. Mr. Larkins decided upon the latter course. Arming himself with a revolver and a flashlight, he made his way carefully into the hall and up the stairs. The first door to the right as he mounted the last step was that of the closed room. Before this room he paused, listening. Certainly it was from here that the sound came. It was more subdued now, but still recognizable. Mr. Larkins argued with himself. Should he enter or not? The agent's warning came to his mind. He decided that, just as a matter of surety, he would look into the other rooms first. There was nothing in them, and when he had finished, the annoying pacing had stopped. Consequently, Mr. Larkins decided to put off his investigation of the closed room until he had fortified himself with more data in regard to the late Brent and his theories. Mr. Larkins was not admitting to himself the possibility of the supernatural. He was still convinced that there was something perfectly natural behind this disturbance. In any event, he reflected, it would do no harm to know a little more about the house. He resolved on the spur of the moment to look up the case of the man who had died after opening the closed room. In accordance with his decision, Mr. Larkins descended to his floor and went directly to the typewriter, where he removed his hero bodily from the machine. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to the late Mr. Brent's co-worker, Jonathan Roberts. On the following day, Mr. Larkins wandered casually down to the offices of the Times, where he spent a considerable part of the afternoon. He emerged at last and carried under his arms a number of newspapers. When he reached number 21, he was pleasantly surprised to find that Mr. Jonathan Roberts had replied to his letter on the preceding night by special messenger. It was the letter, quite a lengthy document, which first engaged Mr. Larkins's attention. Of special interest were these paragraphs constituting the latter part of the letter. Those are a number of his theories, which I have come to regard as fully as ridiculous as the press regards them. But I believe the particular theory you refer to is his theory of the predestination of souls. This was engrossing his attention at a time when I was spending some weeks at Liverpool in attendance upon my mother, who was, at the time, seriously ill. However, I will tell you what I can in regard to the theory. It was his idea that such places as heaven and hell did not exist for the soul. He did not mean to say that he believed that good and evil were also non-existent for the soul after death. On the contrary, his entire theory hinged on this point. He believed that all souls, good and bad alike, were projected into the ether at the moment of death, to roam there for the remainder of their existence, to which he designated no end. For the good souls, happiness abounded, for the evil, only evil. He developed this theory by advancing another, that since these souls were merely passing to and fro in the ether, it would be a comparatively easy thing to draw them back, if one had a body to put them into. The last time I saw him, just before I left for Liverpool, he had actually found a young man who had consented to his plan of driving from the subject's body his soul, and drawing another from the ether to replace it. He admitted that the chief argument against the latter theory was, in the light of his first theory, that in drawing a soul from the ether, one could make no distinction between a good and evil soul. Also, one could not tell to what proportions the evil and good had expanded. He believed, as many of us do, that evil breeds evil, and he said he had the chance of 1 in 100 of drawing a soul of cosmic evil from the ether. In my presence, one day, he made certain vague references to ancient gods of evil. I candidly admit that what he said went over my head. How this experiment of his came out, I cannot say. It was the last he worked, for he was dead when I returned from Liverpool. The papers contained no mention of it. He himself, in his letters to me, letters often as not very incoherent, was very sparse with information regarding it. I gathered, however, that the experiment was a success, or that he believed it so. Most likely the latter, for to admit the former would be to admit his grossly improbable theory to the realm of the probable. Beyond that I can say nothing. I don't think he ever gave me the name of the young man, for I could certainly have looked him up. It was consistently my idea that the fellow was a derelict, or surely his relatives would have some knowledge of him, or having none, would certainly raise a devil of a row over his disappearance. I was under the impression also, from his letters, that Brent kept a diary in his last days, but I could find nothing at the time when I looked about number 21 after his death. However, I remember being in a rush. If you searched, you might find something of interest. Another thing that rather puzzles me. Have you ever wondered about that peculiar bare spot beneath the lilac bush at the back of the house? Very cordially yours, Jonathan Roberts. P.S. If you should want me, call Piccadilly 49A. The last paragraph of the letter caught Mr. Larkins's eye. He resolved to investigate the matter first thing in the morning, regretting somewhat that dusk had fallen so early. The mention of a diary, too, stimulated his interest. He mentally noted that this was another factor to absorb his attention on the following day. Then he gave his attention to the newspapers, going over them one by one and discarding them. From the last he clipped a column which contained a summary of the affair. This clipping he placed beside the letter and proceeded to reread it. London, August 7. The death of Mr. Holman Davitt at number 21 St. John's Wood was last night declared due to heart failure caused by severe shock. Physicians in charge of the inquest were led by the Honourable Seymour Lawler. Mr. Holman Davitt was found dead at his lodgings on August 1st. He was found at the foot of the stairs under circumstances that aroused immediate suspicion and caused an investigation to be made. Nothing, however, was discovered, save that Mr. Davitt seemed to have fallen down the stairs, as several bruises on his body indicated. There were no broken bones. Doctors were loath to declare death due to failure of the heart, because Mr. Davitt's attending physician, Dr. Sax Borden, declared his condition tip-top. It is Dr. Lawler's opinion, as expressed at the final inquest last night, that Mr. Davitt died of fright. Dr. Borden, on the other hand, cites specific instances of Mr. Davitt's bravery and nerve. A peculiar feature of the affair is the curiously hardened and cold condition of the corpse. It is still in the condition in which it was discovered. By way of mention, number 21 was the residence of late John Brent, who was found dead under very similar conditions. Mr. Larkins pondered over the excerpt for a moment, then took up the letter and began to reread it. He noticed with gathering astonishment that neither the clippings nor the letter made mention of the closed room. Did the matter seem too flippant for the respective writers? Or was it merely an oversight? The closed room, as something of importance, began to deteriorate in the eyes of Mr. Larkins. But he could not escape the fact that the body of Mr. DeWitt had been found at the foot of the stairs, down which it had evidently fallen, and Dr. Lawler had mentioned fright. Mr. Collins, the agent, had said that the tenant died soon after the opening of the closed door. Perhaps it was quite possible Collins deceived him. Mr. Larkin observed that Mr. DeWitt might very well have died the same night he opened the door. Could it not then be possible that something in that room so frightened Mr. DeWitt as to bring on heart failure? Mr. Larkins admitted it to himself. He was much disposed to believe it. It would be natural for a realtor to suppress any such story, of course. A clock on the mantel struck 10, and Mr. Larkins shot an enlightened glance toward his bedchamber. He rose, stretched himself, and yawned. He placed the lettering clipping under a paperweight on the top of his table, where he could not fail to see them first thing in the morning. As he turned the light out, he reflected with a half-smile that the hero of Island Gods was still languishing on a desert isle. Mr. Larkins rose much earlier than usual the next morning, but since it was Sunday, he had first to go to Mass. Directly on his return, he went out into the garden behind the house. At the end of the cobblestone walk, he found the lilac bush, and beneath it the spot that Roberts had mentioned. He stopped and frowned down at it. It was nothing more than a vague, irregular patch of ground on which the grass grew very sparsely, in scraggy clumps of thin blades, which appeared at first to be dried, but were instead of some dark color that Mr. Larkins could not identify. To Mr. Larkins it seemed at first glance only the usual bare space that one finds in places where the sun does not shine, where there is continual shadow. Mr. Larkins polished his monocle meditatively and screwed it into his eyes. Then, looking upward, he caught the line of the lilac bush. It was then that he noticed that the bare spot was not directly under the bush. Certainly it was not always in its shadow. Mr. Larkins bent to one knee to inspect the area more closely. In no place under the bush was the grass exceptionally heavy. The strange thing was that the barest spot was that at the extreme outer edge, and that it must be this portion that Roberts had referred to. Mr. Larkins cast a sudden glance at the sky. In less than an hour, the sun would be shining directly upon the spot before him. With an exclamation, he bent again to the scrutiny. Then he noticed that there was a suggestion of definite form to the spot, despite the inroads of grass, something more distinct than he had first imagined. It was a shape inexplicably suggestive of something he knew, something he could recognize. Then suddenly he stared up. His monocle fell from his eye and swung on its ribbon. He bent forward once more. Yes, certainly. It was as if a human body were crouched here on its side, its knees pressed to its breast. For a moment Mr. Larkins stared at it. Did Roberts mean, could it be that this spot marked a grave? Mr. Larkins shuddered and turned his face full into the sunlight. In the house once more, Mr. Larkins began his search for the diary of the scientist. He looked thoroughly in every room. He even penetrated the dismal cellar, but he found nothing. Coming back to his study at last, he considered opening the closed room, but the clipping before him did not argue favorably. It was then that he caught sight of the boarded-up fireplace. He hesitated only for a moment. Then he began to tear boards away. He was not disappointed, though his find was meager. Almost covered with ashes, he found 2 charred pieces of paper, which were most certainly from Brent's diary. He carried them carefully over to his table and placed them side by side with the letter and clipping. But his disappointment rose when he found that the writing was almost illegible, and the contents were most incoherent. The excerpts were dated a week apart. The first read, as well as Mr. Larkins could decipher the script, May 10th. I did it today. It was all I could do. Who would have thought it? 1 chance out of 100. What annoys me is that I have succeeded and cannot announce it to the world. I buried him in the back. I wonder if... Neighbors will see. I shall never forget his face, his air of unholy, of sinful glee, his first struggles for life and expression, face, such cosmic. The remainder of the paper was burnt away. Mr. Larkins would have liked to have known what word followed cosmic. He turned his attention to the second excerpt. May 17th. I know he's dead. It was with my own hands. And still he paces. 1, 2, 3, 4, and over again. And that hellish pounding, my God! Will he never stop? It is driving me mad. People on the street turn and give me curious stares. If I had not locked his room. But surely I am safe here. He cannot come here. How could it be? It is to defy all the laws that mankind had been brought up to revere. But have I not myself proved the folly of those very laws I now champion? What am I writing? As if the atmosphere of this old house could harm me. It is all my imagination. But no. There he goes again, pounding and pacing, seeking for substance, for a new body, for a new material entity. He will need three living bodies. What have I done? His room must not be opened. It establishes a link, a contact with that thing out there. It will draw him closer and closer and closer. God, that devilish pacing. Always. What if he could come out? Mr. Larkins was startled, to say the least. His natural conservatism urged him to take these excerpts as proof of Brent's insanity, but something in him was inclined toward the opposite view. It was the second excerpt that seemed to awaken a long-dead memory in Mr. Larkins's mind. It was of something he had read long ago, something that drummed insistently through his consciousness. He could not recall the title of the work, but it seemed to him to be an old paper on certain forms of ancient, barbaric magic mingled with designated ritualistic rites of old Chinese ancestor worshippers. It seemed to him that there had been certain notes, certain cryptic comments, that virtually underscored a sentence in the second excerpt of Brent's diary. Seeking for substance for a new body, for a new material entity, he will need three living bodies. There was something of age-old gods of evil, genii older than those of the Arabian Nights, who inhabited the nethermost spaces of the cosmos. And there were paragraphs of weird, horrible rites, of materialization of these ancient demons, and certainly there was something of three living sacrifices, from whom all life was extracted, leaving them cold and stiffened as Arctic stone. Mr. Larkins was stunned by the immensity of his speculations. His mind was channeled. It led but to one thing. Could it be that the fingers of Mr. Brent's ghastly experiment had reached much farther than intended? That the experiment had reached through space into the cosmos and touched upon... Mr. Larkins shook off the impression and slipped the excerpts together with the letter and clipping under the paperweight. Then he rose, donned his topcoat and stick, and went for an afternoon in Hyde Park. Somewhat delayed on the underground, Mr. Larkins arrived at number 21 shortly after dark had fallen. He had forgotten all about the matter of the closed room, eager to rescue the hero of island gods from the desert island. He had moved his hero approximately 20 miles into the mid-ocean when the pacing began. Mr. Larkins stopped work at once. He cast a sidelong glance at his flash and revolver, still where he had put them 2 nights before. His conservatism urged him to investigate. Again, some opposing factor urged him to flee, to leave the house. But his conservatism won. Mr. Larkins took up his flashlight and revolver and crept cautiously up the stairs. Halfway up, he stopped and listened. The disturbance was exactly the same as that of the night before. Then, tightening his grasp on his weapon, he went resolutely on. It was only natural that he should stop a moment to listen before the door, before he took from his keyring the key to open the room. For an interval he heard nothing, then the slow, monotonous pacing sound again, He threw open the door and shot his flash around. There was nothing in the room, but the pacing continued. Suddenly, inexplicably, Mr. Larkins felt frightened. Had he but found some living thing, something to challenge? But this inexplicable nothingness, and that awful pacing. Then, abruptly, his flashlight went out. For a moment, Mr. Larkins was stunned. Then he noticed that the window at the end of the room looked directly down on the lilac bush, and above the bare spot hung a shadow, distinct in the glow of the street lamp. A shadow that was not of the lilac bush. Mr. Larkins watched as if fascinated. The shadow rose like a cloud, hung for a moment suspended in the air, then shot swiftly toward the window. Mr. Larkins turned to flee, and at that instant he saw before him, lined against the window, an awful thing. He ran headlong into the hall and down the stairs. As he fumbled at the door of his library, he threw over his shoulders a quick, scared glance. Then the door opened, and he stumbled into the room. At once he slammed the door to, and stood with his back against it, breathing heavily. Leaning there, he listened. From upstairs came a sound as of a heavy, lumbering object pacing, and almost immediately after, an ominous creak of hall boards. Suddenly, the monophone of the table caught Mr. Larkins's eye, and close by the letter from Roberts, in a flash the postscript. "If you should want me, call Piccadilly 49A." He found himself at the instrument, frantically repeating a number to the operator. Then from over the wire a voice. "Roberts! Larkins! Listen! I've opened the closed room, and it's coming, down the stairs, a horrible thing from that spot. The grave under the bush. I can hear it coming. A great, awful thing. What ungodly creature is buried there? It towers, ghoul-like, but with a face, a human face that glows hellishly, a glow that lights its every contour. It is evil, cosmic evil, and cold as Arctic stone. There are ancient gods. It is all clear now. Your letter, the diary, Brent. It is still on the stairs, but it is coming. Coming. There is something wrong. I cannot move, as if I were chained. But I will shoot this thing. It is in the hall now. The knob is turning. Oh, Christ!" The monophone struck the table with a loud clatter. Immediately after, a shot echoed through the house. It was the shot that brought the Bobby who discovered the author's body. The Bobby says that the body was very cold and rigid, as if something vital had been drawn from it. Yet he affirms that he entered the house immediately after the shot. This certainly cannot be true. He also asserts that there was someone else in the house, for he distinctly remembers a ghastly chill about his throat, a sudden draft, as if someone had opened a door somewhere, and the steady, low-pacing sound creeping away into the distance.